The air in the studio was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that crackled like static electricity. It wasn't just another episode of Face the Nation. This was a showdown. On one side, Marcus Bennett, the show's notoriously sharp-tongued host, a liberal lion ready to pounce. On the other, JD Vance, the newly minted vice president, a man who'd seemingly performed a political 180, going from Trump critic to his right-hand man. The buzz was deafening, the stakes sky-high. The studio lights blazed, almost cruelly bright, as Vance stepped onto the set. Fresh from taking his oath of office, he exuded a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from a man who believes he has nothing to hide. But Bennett, with a predatory glint in his eyes, had other plans. His producer had promised a respectful discussion about the new administration, but everyone in the control room knew that was a smokescreen. Bennett had spent weeks preparing for this, sharpening his questions like knives. As Vance took his seat, the pre-interview pleasantries were rushed, almost perfunctory. Bennett's smile never quite reached his eyes, and the production team seemed unusually tense, their faces tight with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Vance, drawing on his Marine Corps training, sensed the ambush immediately. Every instinct screamed that Bennett's questions were loaded, booby-trapped with hidden landmines. The first question came wrapped in a veneer of politeness, yet Vance couldn't help but notice Bennett's white-knuckled grip on his interview cards. "Mr. Vice President," Bennett began, his voice oozing an artificial sweetness that made Vance's skin crawl. "Let's talk about your remarkable journey. From vocal Trump critic to his second-in-command. Quite the transformation, wouldn't you say?" Vance returned a measured smile, his eyes reflecting a hard-won wisdom. "You know, Marcus, that's actually a perfect place to start," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth, for understanding." The audience, a sea of expectant faces, leaned forward, surprised by the absence of defensiveness in Vance's response. Bennett shifted in his chair, his carefully rehearsed follow-up suddenly losing its edge. He hadn't expected such a calm, philosophical opening. "Growth and understanding?" Bennett scoffed, his tone laced with derision. "Is that what we're calling it now? Some might argue it's just political convenience. A rather expedient shift, wouldn't you agree?" "You see, Marcus," Vance replied steadily, unfazed by the jab. "In America, we cherish the tradition of changing our minds when presented with new information. When I criticized the president years ago, I viewed things through a narrow lens. But then, I witnessed something remarkable. I saw his policies begin to help the forgotten Americans I wrote about in my book, the people I grew up with, the people who'd been left behind." A moment of silence hung in the air, Bennett's expression tightening almost imperceptibly. He was losing control of the narrative. Vance continued, his gaze direct, yet unchallenging. "Let me ask you something, Marcus. Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at the evidence and realized your first judgment might have been wrong?" Bennett's pause lingered a fraction too long. The question had clearly hit a nerve. "We're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President, not mine," he snapped, shuffling his cards as if eager to launch his next attack. He needed to regain the upper hand. "Speaking of changes," Bennett continued, his voice regaining its sharp edge, "let's discuss your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mix of church and state? A blurring of the lines that our founding fathers explicitly warned against?" The audience tensed. Bennett had just trodden on sacred ground, a risky move even for him. But the spark in Vance's eyes revealed he'd been waiting for precisely this challenge. He was ready. "Divine guidance, Marcus?" Vance leaned forward, his voice resonating with conviction. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith. They were afraid of tyranny. They understood that a nation without a moral compass is a nation adrift." A ripple of amens echoed from the crowd, a spontaneous show of support that clearly unsettled Bennett. "But surely, in our modern, diverse society," Bennett began, only to be gently cut off as Vance raised his hand, a gesture of both authority and respect. "Let me finish this thought because it's important," Vance said, his tone remaining respectful yet firm. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, the same way leaders have done throughout our nation's history. Not because we're establishing a state religion, but because we recognize that our rights come from God, not merely from government. It's a recognition of a higher power, a source of morality that transcends the whims of politicians." Bennett glanced at his producer, who was watching intently from the sidelines, his face a mask of concern. The interview was slipping away from them. Then, Vance added, his voice carrying a note of personal reflection. "You know what's interesting, Marcus? When I was a Marine, nobody questioned our chaplain's presence. Nobody complained when we prayed before missions. Because in those moments of truth, even the skeptics understood there was something deeper than politics, something that transcended the immediate danger." Bennett's face flushed a deep crimson. He clearly hadn't anticipated this line of defense. Let's move on to your relationship with President Trump," he stammered, trying to regain control. "Your recent statement about him being God's instrument for America's renewal. Don't you think that's a bit extreme? A bit messianic?" "What I think is extreme, Marcus," Vance replied calmly, his demeanor unshaken, "is how some in the media seem more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that hurt American families. You seem more offended by faith than by failure." He paused, letting his words settle over the silent studio. "But since you brought up President Trump, let's talk about results instead of rhetoric. Let's discuss what's really happening in our communities since the inauguration. Let's talk about the jobs that are coming back, the hope that's being restored." The studio fell into a remarkable quiet, a silence punctuated only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Even Bennett's trademark rapid-fire interruptions were momentarily subdued, overwhelmed by Vance's steady presence and measured responses. The hunter had become the hunted. Bennett's composure began to crack. He was visibly sweating. "Let's talk about your background, Mr. Vice President," he said, his voice strained. "You've written about your humble beginnings, your struggles. Yet now you're sitting here, in the halls of power. Some might say you've forgotten where you came from, that you've become detached." "That's interesting, Marcus," Vance replied evenly, a hint of steel entering his voice. "Because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by how well they fit into the Washington elite's expectations. We judge them by their actions, not by their address." "Character," Bennett scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call this complete reversal on Trump? You once wrote quite passionately against him. You called him a danger to the Republic, and now—" "Yes, I did," Vance admitted, unflinchingly. "And you know what takes more character? Admitting when you're wrong, standing up for what you believe in, even when people like you twist it into something it's not, even when the media tries to paint you as a hypocrite." The audience murmured in agreement, a low rumble of approval that further unnerved Bennett. He tugged at his collar, his tone laced with desperation. "Mr. Vice President, you've built your reputation as a voice for working-class Americans. Yet here you are, in an expensive suit, defending a billionaire. Don't you see the irony? The disconnect?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, as several audience members shifted uncomfortably. But Vance's expression remained unchanged, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying this. "You know what I see, Marcus," he said softly. "I see someone who thinks an expensive suit can change a man's values. Let me tell you something. These values, the ones I learned from my grandmother in Middletown, Ohio, they don't change with your zip code or your job title. They're ingrained. They're part of who I am." Bennett's eyes narrowed. He was losing, and he knew it. So you're saying your transformation has nothing to do with political ambition? That we should just ignore your past criticisms? That we should simply accept that you're now President Trump's new... He paused, letting the word hang in the air, heavy with accusation. Puppet. The word struck the room like a thrown gauntlet, a blatant attempt to provoke. Several audience members gasped audibly. This was the knockout punch Bennett had been waiting for. But Vance's response came with the precision of a master chess player, calm, calculated, and devastating. "You know, Marcus," he said, his voice measured yet laced with steel. "That word, puppet, reveals more about you than it does about me." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "In your world, maybe strong loyalty to someone you respect is something to mock, something to be suspicious of. But let me tell you what I learned as a Marine. In combat, you learn to judge a person's character by their actions, not by what the media says about them. You learn to trust the person next to you, to have their back no matter what. I have seen President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues have created, the cartoon villain you portray on your show. I have seen his genuine concern for the American people, his unwavering commitment to this country." The audience erupted into applause, spontaneous and heartfelt. Bennett tried to interject, but Vance pressed on, his voice rising above the din. "You call it being a puppet. I call it recognizing true leadership when I see it. And yes, I'm proud to serve alongside President Trump. I'm proud to be part of an administration that's fighting for the forgotten men and women of this country." Bennett's voice dripped with sarcasm, a last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "A man of your intellectual background must see the contradiction in supporting someone you once so vehemently criticized. Surely you can't deny the intellectual dishonesty." "There you go again, Marcus," Vance replied calmly, shaking his head slightly. "You're so focused on finding contradictions that you're missing the point entirely. The real contradiction is ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes, just to please critics like yourself. The real intellectual dishonesty is pretending that people can't learn, grow, and change their minds." Thunderous applause followed his words, a wave of support that washed over Bennett, leaving him stranded and exposed. He glanced at his producer, who gestured frantically from the sidelines, a clear signal to cut the segment. But Vance wasn't finished. "And since you brought up my intellectual background," he added with a slight smile, "it just goes to show that true wisdom isn't measured by how many contradictions you can find or how many degrees you have, but by the strength to learn and grow, the courage to admit when you're wrong, and the humility to listen to others." He paused, then turned his attention back to Bennett. "Why don't we talk about the intellectual dishonesty in your coverage of this administration, Marcus?" Bennett began, his tone edged with accusation. "My coverage?" "Yes," JD Vance smoothly interjected, cutting him off. "Because just last week, you devoted an entire segment to questioning my faith, suggesting it was nothing more than convenient election season Christianity, a cynical ploy to win votes." Bennett's face reddened. "I was merely pointing out the timing," he stammered, clearly caught off guard. But Vance leaned forward, cutting him off again, his voice gaining intensity. "The timing of what exactly? The fact that I've been attending the same church since before I entered politics? Or perhaps you'd like to question my grandmother's faith too? The woman who taught me to pray before every meal, even when we had little to share. The woman who instilled in me the values I hold dear." A woman in the front row nodded vigorously at his words, her eyes shining with tears. This was resonating. "Let me be clear, Marcus," Vance continued, his voice carrying both strength and dignity. "You can question my politics. You can disagree with my decisions. But when you start suggesting that my faith is nothing more than a political prop, you're not just attacking me. You're attacking every American who holds their faith dear. You're insulting millions of people who find strength and solace in their beliefs." Bennett glanced at his notes, clearly searching for safer ground. He was floundering. Let's talk about your recent statements," he insisted, desperately trying to regain control. Yes, let's talk about statements, Vance agreed, his voice unwavering. Like your remark last month that anyone who supports traditional values is, and I quote, living in the past. Tell me, Marcus, do you really think the millions of Americans who go to church every Sunday, who believe in family values, who love their country, are they all just living in the past? Are they all relics of a bygone era, hopelessly out of touch with your enlightened worldview? A defining silence fell over the studio, a silence so profound it felt almost oppressive. Bennett's carefully crafted persona, his mask of intellectual superiority, was beginning to crumble. He fumbled with his papers, his hands visibly shaking. "Mr. Vice President, you're trying to turn this interview around," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "No, Marcus," Vance said steadily, his gaze unwavering. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation. A conversation about the contempt you and your colleagues seem to have for regular Americans, for people who don't share your worldview, for people who hold different beliefs." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You invited me here thinking you could shame me for my beliefs, my background, and my support for the president. But let's talk about what really bothers you." The studio grew deathly quiet, every eye fixed on him. The tension was palpable. "It bothers you," Vance continued, his voice low but resonant, "that someone can come from where I come from and not subscribe to your worldview. It bothers you that I can be educated at Yale Law School and still hold traditional values. And most of all, it bothers you that I can see right through the game you're playing. The game of manufactured outrage, of selective reporting, of demonizing anyone who dares to disagree with you." Bennett attempted to regain control, his voice strained. "Your accusations are—" Vance's expression hardened for the first time, a flicker of righteous anger crossing his face. "They're not accusations, Marcus. They're observations. Like how you rolled your eyes when I mentioned prayer earlier. Or how you mockingly referred to my hometown as Trump country on your show last week. Or how you consistently misrepresent the views of millions of Americans, painting them as ignorant, bigoted, and out of touch." His rebuke hit like a thunderclap, leaving the audience in stunned silence. "You see, this isn't about politics," Vance continued, his voice firm but controlled. "It's about respect. Respect for faith, for traditional values, for the millions of Americans who don't need your approval to love their country or support their president. It's about basic human decency, something that seems to be in short supply in the media these days." Bennett's face drained of color as he glanced at his producer, who now watched the exchange with a mix of concern and fascination. Clearly, the interview had veered far from Bennett's planned ambush. This was a complete and utter rout. "Perhaps we should move on," Bennett began, checking his watch, a clear sign of defeat. "I noticed you've been doing that ever since we started talking about faith and values," Vance observed with a slight smile. "Uncomfortable territory for you, Marcus. Is it difficult to defend your views when you're confronted with someone who doesn't fit neatly into your preconceived boxes?" A few chuckles rose from the audience, as Bennett's discomfort became plain to see. He was squirming in his seat. "For someone who prides himself on hard-hitting journalism," Vance went on, his voice relentless, "you seem remarkably eager to change the subject when the conversation doesn't go your way, when you're challenged, when your assumptions are questioned." Bennett tried one last, desperate attack, a final attempt to salvage some shred of credibility. "Is this the same kind of deflection you used when you switched from criticizing Trump to praising him? Is this your standard operating procedure, to simply change the subject when confronted with your own inconsistencies?" "There you go again, Marcus," Vance replied, calmly, shaking his head. "You keep coming back to that, don't you? You're obsessed with my past criticisms. Let me ask you something. Have you ever changed your mind about someone after getting to know them personally, after seeing their true character? Instead of relying on media narratives, on secondhand accounts, on the carefully crafted portrayals of your colleagues?" An elderly woman in the audience called out, her voice trembling with emotion. "Tell him, Mr. Vice President, tell him the truth!" "You know what the real story is here, Marcus?" Vance's voice carried the weight of conviction, a deep resonance that filled the studio. "It's not about my past criticisms or my current position. It's about something that terrifies you and your colleagues. The fact that someone can think for themselves, change their mind based on direct experience, and stand firm in their beliefs despite relentless media attacks. The idea that someone can be independent, that they don't need your permission to hold their opinions." Bennett began sweating visibly, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before the cameras. "Mr. Vice President, you're twisting my words," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "No, Marcus, I'm just holding up a mirror," Vance interjected calmly, his gaze unwavering. "And I don't think you like what you see. A journalist who came here hoping to embarrass me, to score cheap political points, only to expose his own prejudices, his own biases, his own contempt for a large segment of the American population." He turned to address the audience directly, his voice filled with passion. "You see, what Marcus doesn't understand is that true integrity isn't about never changing your mind. It's about having the courage to admit when you're wrong, even when people like him are waiting to pounce, waiting to exploit your vulnerability for their own gain." The audience erupted in their loudest applause yet, a sustained roar of approval, with even some of the production crew nodding in agreement. This was no longer an interview, it was a public reckoning. "When I first met President Trump," Vance continued, his voice carrying quiet authority, "I had a choice. I could have clung to my preconceptions, to the negative image painted by the media. Or I could judge him by his actions, by his words, by his genuine love for this country. I chose truth over pride. I chose to see for myself. And that's something your network might want to try sometime, actually reporting the truth instead of shaping it to fit your agenda." At that, Bennett glanced desperately at his producer, who made a swift, slashing motion across his throat, the universal signal to wrap it up, to cut the feed, to end the disaster. The interview was a complete and utter failure, a spectacular backfire. "And you know what else, Marcus?" Vance added, his voice rising above the din of applause. "The American people are tired. They're tired of being looked down upon for their faith, tired of being mocked for their values, and most of all, they're weary of journalists who think their job is to tell people what to think instead of reporting the truth, of presenting the facts and letting people make up their own minds." In an instant, the entire studio audience was on its feet, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Bennett's attempts to regain control, to interject, to salvage some semblance of dignity, were drowned out by the thunderous applause. His carefully orchestrated ambush had backfired spectacularly, resulting in a public humiliation of epic proportions. Bennett cleared his throat, his demeanor completely deflated, his confidence shattered. "Well, I think we're about out of time," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, I believe we are," Vance agreed, rising from his chair, his posture erect, his expression resolute. "But before I go, I'd like to say one last thing to the American people watching at home." He turned to face the camera directly, his gaze sincere and unwavering. "What you've witnessed today isn't just about one interview or one journalist's attempt to discredit me. It's about something much more important. It's about standing firm in your convictions, even when it's unpopular, even when it's difficult." He paused, letting his words sink in. "They thought they could shame me for my faith. They thought they could mock my support for President Trump. They thought that they could force me to apologize for believing in traditional values. But here's what they don't understand. These aren't merely political positions. These are the principles that built America, the values that sustained us through hard times, and the truths that will guide us forward. These are the bedrock of our nation." Vance straightened his tie and stood tall, his presence commanding. "To every American who's been ridiculed for their faith, mocked for their values, or told they're on the wrong side of history, stand strong. Don't be intimidated. Don't be silenced. Because at the end of the day, character isn't about winning the approval of critics. It's about staying true to what you believe in, to your core principles, to the values that make you who you are. As Vance walked off the set, the audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to last an eternity, a wave of applause that shook the studio to its core. Bennett sat in stunned silence, his face pale, his eyes glazed over, his carefully planned ambush utterly dismantled by a display of unwavering principle and quiet strength. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey had emerged victorious. And that proves one thing. Sometimes the best response to arrogance is dignity, and the strongest answer to bias is truth. Unwavering, unshakable truth. In a world of constant change, where opinions shift like sand dunes, and the media often prioritizes sensationalism over substance, it's more important than ever to cultivate the power of conviction. To stand firm in your beliefs, not out of stubbornness or pride, but out of a deep-seated understanding of your values and a commitment to truth. But how do we develop this inner strength? How do we navigate a culture that often pressures us to conform, to compromise, to silence our own voices? Here are a few key principles. Know your values. What truly matters to you? What principles guide your decisions? Take the time to reflect on your core beliefs, to define what you stand for. Write them down. This will serve as your anchor in turbulent times. Seek truth, not confirmation. Don't fall into the trap of only consuming information that confirms your existing biases. Be open to challenging your own assumptions, to learning from different perspectives. True wisdom comes from a willingness to engage with opposing viewpoints. Embrace growth and change. Having strong convictions doesn't mean being inflexible. Be open to changing your mind when presented with new evidence, with compelling arguments. Growth is a sign of strength, not weakness. Develop moral courage. Standing up for what you believe in, especially when it's unpopular, requires courage. It means being willing to face criticism, ridicule, and even ostracism. But remember, the respect of others is fleeting. Self-respect is enduring. Find your tribe. Surround yourself with people who share your values, who support your growth, and who challenge you to be your best self. A strong community provides strength and encouragement. Practice humility. Being firm and holding your ground does not mean to look down on others. Humility is vital. The story of JD Vance's interview highlights the power of conviction in action. He faced a hostile interviewer, a barrage of loaded questions, and a clear attempt to discredit him. Yet, he remained calm, respectful, and unwavering in his beliefs. He didn't back down, he didn't apologize, and he didn't compromise his principles. What are your thoughts on the importance of conviction in today's world? Share your experiences and insights in the comments below. And if you found this article valuable, please like and subscribe to the channel for more content on personal growth, leadership, and navigating the challenges of our time. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful content.